On November 24th, 2009, 26-year-old John Edward Jones entered Nutty Putty Cave in Utah with his brother and several friends for what was supposed to be a fun caving expedition. 28 hours later, John would be dead, trapped upside down in a narrow passage 700 feet inside the cave, in a space so tight that rescuers could barely reach him. This is the story of the Nutty Putty Cave disaster, one of the most tragic and claustrophobic deaths in caving history. Nutty Putty Cave was located near Salt Lake City, Utah, in the hills west of Utah Lake. It wasn't a grand, spectacular cave system like Mammoth Cave or Carlsbad Caverns. It was a relatively small hydrothermal cave and about 1,400 feet long, formed by the passage of warm water through limestone over thousands of years. What made Nutty Putty unique and popular was its tight, twisting passages. The cave was full of narrow tunnels, tight squeezes, and challenging crawl spaces that attracted amateur cavers looking for an adventure. It was considered a beginner cave because it wasn't particularly deep or technically difficult, but it required some degree of physical fitness and a tolerance for confined spaces. The cave got its unusual name from the brown, putty-like clay that covered parts of the interior. When you touched it, it had a soft, malleable texture like nutty putty. The name stuck. Nutty Putty had been discovered in 1960 and had been a popular caving destination for decades. Thousands of people had explored it over the years. It was managed by the Bureau of Land Management and was generally considered safe for recreational caving, though it had been temporarily closed at times due to vandalism and safety concerns. The cave had several named passages and chambers. There was the Big Slide, a steep descent into the cave. There was the Birth Canal, an extremely narrow passage that cavers had to squeeze through, and there was a section called Bob's Push, named after a caver who had first explored it, which was particularly tight and challenging. John Jones was an experienced caver. He had explored Nutty Putty Cave multiple times before, including as a young Boy Scout. He knew the cave well, or at least he thought he did. On November 24th, 2009, the day before Thanksgiving, John decided to take his brother Josh and several friends and family members on a caving trip. It was supposed to be a fun bonding experience. The group entered the cave around 8 p.m. John was in good spirits. He was a medical student at the University of Virginia, newly married, with a young daughter and another child on the way. He was fit, athletic, and comfortable in confined spaces. Cave exploring was one of his favorite hobbies. As the group made their way deeper into the cave, John decided he wanted to find a particular passage he remembered from previous visits. He was looking for a challenging section, a tight squeeze that would test his skills. He thought he knew where he was going. But in the darkness, with only headlamps for light, all the passages looked similar. The cave was a maze of twisting tunnels. John made a wrong turn. He entered a passage that looked like the one he was searching for. It was tight, very tight, but that's what he expected. He began to squeeze through, moving forward and downward at a steep angle. The passage got narrower and narrower, and then narrower still. John realized something was wrong. This passage was getting too tight. He tried to back up, but the angle was too steep and the space too confined. He couldn't get leverage. He couldn't push himself backward. The passage had become a trap. He was stuck, and he was upside down, head first in a narrow tube of rock 700 feet from the cave entrance. The passage John was trapped in was later measured. At its narrowest point, it was only 10 inches wide and 18 inches high. John's body was wedged in at a 70-degree angle, upside down, with his arms pinned above his head. His feet were about 10 feet higher than his head. Being upside down for extended periods is extremely dangerous for the human body. Blood pools in the head and upper body. The heart has to work much harder to pump blood. Breathing becomes difficult as the weight of the internal organs presses down on the lungs. Given enough time, the position alone can kill you. Josh, John's brother, realized John was in trouble. He tried to help, but the passage was too tight for anyone to reach John effectively. The group made the decision to get help immediately. At 10:30 p.m., about 2.5 hours after they entered the cave, emergency services were called. The Utah County Sheriff's Office was notified. Cave rescue teams were assembled. Word went out to experienced cavers throughout the region. What followed was one of the most difficult and heartbreaking rescue operations in caving history. The first rescuers entered the cave around midnight. When they reached John's location, They were confronted with a nightmare scenario. John was wedged in a passage so tight that rescuers could barely fit into the space themselves. They certainly couldn't maneuver. One rescuer could reach John's feet. Another could work his way down and reach John's legs. But getting to John's upper body, where they could actually communicate with him and assess his condition, was nearly impossible. The passage was at such a steep downward angle that rescuers had to work upside down themselves just to reach John. And the space was so confined that only one person could work at a time. It was hot, humid, and claustrophobic. The rescuers were working in conditions that most people would find unbearable, trying to save a man who was in an even worse situation. John was conscious and able to talk when rescuers first reached him. He was scared, but trying to remain calm. He knew he was in serious trouble. Rescuers tried to reassure him. They told him they would get him out. They just needed time. The rescue plan was to try to pull John back up through the passage he had descended. To do this, they needed to create an anchor point and attach a pulley system to John's body. Rescuers worked for hours, threading ropes through the narrow spaces, setting up anchors in the cave walls, and carefully attaching a harness to John's legs and lower body. It was agonizingly slow work. Every movement had to be calculated. The space was so tight that rescuers could barely move. Tools had to be passed hand to hand through the narrow passages. Communication was difficult. And all the while, John was hanging upside down, his body slowly deteriorating. After hours of preparation, rescuers attempted to pull John out using the pulley system. For a brief, hopeful moment, it worked. They managed to move John about a foot, lifting him slightly in the passage. Rescuers could see progress. John could feel movement. There was hope. And then the anchor failed. The rock it was bolted into cracked and gave way. The rope system collapsed. John slid back down into the passage, even deeper than before. He was now in a worse position than when the rescue began. The mood among rescuers shifted from determined optimism to grim reality. They tried to set up another pulley system, but the rock in this section of the cave wasn't stable enough to support the forces required to pull a 200-pound man up through such a tight passage at such a steep angle. Hours passed. John was now approaching 20 hours upside down. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. He was having increasing difficulty breathing. He was in and out of consciousness. His body was shutting down. Rescuers tried everything. They considered breaking through the rock to widen the passage, but the cave was too unstable. Attempting to chisel or blast through might cause a collapse that would kill John and trap the rescuers. They considered amputation, cutting off John's legs to free his body, but the position made it impossible to perform such a procedure safely, and John likely wouldn't survive the trauma and blood loss, given his already compromised state. They tried different rope configurations, different angles, different techniques. Nothing worked. The physics of the situation was simply impossible. You can't easily pull a person upward through a 10-inch gap when they're wedged in at a downward angle. Gravity was working against them. The rock was working against them. Time was working against them. John's wife, Emily, was brought to the cave entrance. She couldn't go to where John was. The passage was too dangerous and too tight, but rescuers set up a communication relay so she could talk to him. Emily spoke to John, telling him she loved him, that their daughter was waiting for him, that he needed to keep fighting. John told her he loved her. He told her to take care of their daughter. It was the last conversation they would ever have. On November 25th, 2009, at approximately 12:30 a.m., roughly 28 hours after he became trapped, John Edward Jones died in Nutty Putty Cave. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, brought on by being inverted for too long. His body had simply given out. Rescuers were devastated. They had worked for over 24 hours straight in impossible conditions, risking their own lives, and they had failed. Some of them were crying. Some were angry. All of them were traumatized. But the tragedy wasn't over. Now they faced another horrible reality, retrieving John's body. The passage John was trapped in was simply too tight, too unstable, and too dangerous to allow for body recovery. Rescuers couldn't pull John out. They had already proven that. They couldn't widen the passage without risking a collapse. And sending more people into that section of the cave would only put more lives at risk. After consultations with engineers, cave experts, and John's family, An unprecedented decision was made. John's body would be left in the cave. Nutty Putty Cave would become his tomb. Explosives were used to collapse the entrance to the passage where John's body lay, sealing it off. Then the entire cave was permanently closed. The entrance was filled with concrete. A plaque was placed at the site. Nutty Putty Cave, which had been a recreational caving destination for nearly 50 years, was closed forever. John Jones was 26 years old when he died. He left behind his wife, Emily, his 13-month-old daughter, Elizabeth, and an unborn child he would never meet. His family was shattered. His friends and the caving community were in shock. And the rescuers who had fought so hard to save him carried psychological scars that many still bear today. The Nutty Putty Cave disaster raised difficult questions about recreational caving, cave safety, and rescue protocols. Should the cave have been closed earlier? Should there have been more warnings about the dangerous passages? Should amateur cavers be allowed into such tight technical spaces without supervision? Some argued that Nutty Putty should never have been open to the public. The cave's tight passages and confusing layout made it inherently dangerous. The fact that multiple people had gotten stuck in it over the years, though all had been successfully rescued, before John should have been a warning sign. Others argued that caving, like any adventure sport, comes with inherent risks. John was an experienced caver who made a mistake in navigation. Accidents happen. The tragedy was heartbreaking, but it wasn't the fault of the cave or the authorities who managed it. The rescue operation itself was criticized by some experts, though most agreed the rescuers did everything humanly possible under impossible circumstances. The terrain, the position, the time constraints, all of it worked against a successful rescue. No one has proposed a realistic alternative plan that would have saved John's life. What's undeniable is that John's death was preventable. If he hadn't entered that passage, he would still be alive. If the cave had been mapped better, or if that particular passage had been marked as dangerous, he might not have made the fatal wrong turn. If the rescue had gone differently, if the anchor hadn't failed, if they'd gotten to him faster, maybe he would have survived. But none of that happened. And John died in one of the most horrific ways imaginable, alone in the dark, upside down, trapped in rock, unable to move, slowly suffocating as his body failed. The claustrophobia alone is enough to trigger anxiety in most people. Add in the physical trauma of being inverted, the psychological horror of being trapped, the knowledge that you're dying, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. It's almost unimaginable. John's family has spoken publicly about the tragedy, keeping his memory alive and advocating for cave safety. Emily remarried years later and has tried to build a new life, though she has said she will never fully recover from losing John in such a traumatic way. The rescuers who worked to save John have also struggled. Many of them consider it the worst call of their careers. Some have received therapy for PTSD. The image of John trapped in that passage, the sound of his labored breathing, the feeling of helplessness, these things haunt them. Today, the site of Nutty Putty Cave is unmarked except for a small memorial plaque. The concrete-filled entrance is overgrown with vegetation. Nature is slowly reclaiming the area. Most people who pass by have no idea that beneath their feet lies a sealed cave with a young man's body still trapped inside. John Edward Jones will be in Nutty Putty Cave forever. His body will never be recovered. He will never have a traditional burial. His final resting place is a narrow passage of rock, sealed off from the world, where he spent his last terrifying hours. The story of Nutty Putty Cave is a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how a simple mistake can have catastrophic consequences, and how some situations are beyond human ability to fix. It's a story about the limits of rescue technology, the dangers of adventure sports, and the thin line between exploration and tragedy. It's also a story about love, about a wife who rushed to the cave to be near her dying husband, about rescuers who risked everything trying to save a stranger, about a family that has worked to honor John's memory rather than be consumed by bitterness. Nutty Putty Cave is closed. It will never be opened again. The passages that once challenged and thrilled thousands of cavers are now silent and dark, accessible to no one, except for John. He's still there. He always will be. And that is perhaps the most haunting part of all.